performance and re-performance. We're fortunate to have Alastair, MacLennan, Amanda Coogan and Marilyn Arsem. I'm Shirley McWilliam.
Amanda Coogan is my name, and I would say that my practice is primarily live performance based, but I also make videos, photographs, but I'm probably sculpture, but all of these terms are so relevant and interrelated, but all swimming around the core of my practice as live performance artist. I also completed my practice-based PhD here, just about a while ago. I'm just over it, and in my my question really and my exploration was about the place of live performance in the contemporary art world at the moment. So,
I've been making performances since the late 70s and have probably made almost every possible type of performance. I always say that hesitantly because I don't think I've ever cut myself actively, in a performance. I mean, I've done it by mistake, but so I haven't done every kind of performance. But I've done collaborative work and I've directed group performances, but primarily my practice now is to do solo work. And for the last 20 years, I've been mostly creating work in response to very particular sites and locations, and so I've traveled and not brought a prepared work in advance, but worked with the conditions that I encountered in the location. So the work has really varied according to what I find in a new place. Oh, and I was teaching performance art for a long time, but I've quit.
Yeah, doing performance art, but coming out of a fine art context, painting, drawing, sculpture, kind of installational situation, and maybe for the past roughly 40 years doing what people call performance art. Primarily during the first decades it would be solo work, some of it quite long, durational work, but I say within the last 15 years, 16 years or so, working with the groups as well, like Black Market International, and doing duo works, working with another artist or with other artists, and also with Be Beyond. It's been operating since I think 2001, kind of sharing creativity simultaneously and see what happens. But also in personal practice, coming very much from certain things I would have absorbed and learned from Zen practice for about 30 years, close to 40 years. Yeah.
Reenacting them in some way in the present has become part of a kind of currency that we have seen in galleries and that we have seen in museums and we have seen debated, and I think there's also been a certain amount of a kind of almost a flurry of not exactly unease, but kind of reaction to how some of that has been valued or how some of it has been seen. And I think that, or my assumption, I suppose, is that what's at stake are sort of two things. And one is what we think of as the identity of performance and how we define it, and whether we define it as something which is exclusive in certain ways or inclusive in certain ways. And then the second thing is how we make our history of it, and how we pass on the sort of the recording or the memories or the knowledge of certain experiences that people have had and certain events that have happened. If you have a a 3-month exhibition period as a performance artist and in a museum, how does that work? You know, how does it function, and how does performance sit in that space? Now, part of it is, you know, what do you do in there, or how does it be? But part of it is also what happens once you start trying to negotiate that. And you were just talking about,
And what happens when you're not in the room?
which seemed to be the real big,
That was
big
their issue. You know, a museum wants to have stuff for the public to look at. So, and yeah, so if you're not performing from, you know, the time the museum opens to the time it closes, what's there instead of you? And I've been trying to make the case that the whole point of an empty room is really important with live performance in a museum, in that if I'm not there, there's nothing. They're not quite buying it. I took the minimalist approach. I mean, you know, are there things on the walls, things in a vitrine? It's a really interesting debate, which I've never encountered because, of course, I've operated outside of the museum system in the United States. And so, you know, performing in a gallery or in a festival, there's an acceptance of it happening when it happens, and, you know, on to the next thing afterwards. So being considered maybe an object is a new phenomenon for me.
and was when the exhibition was first being discussed, were you asked whether you would do performances that you'd done before? Was that the approach, or was the approach more open?
I think it was more open. I had done a performance in the museum a couple of years ago, which unnerved them because I said I wanted to be invisible, and I ended up lying underneath a bench in the Egyptian mummy room, wrapped up for the day. And many of the people coming into the gallery were not even aware that I was there. And it wasn't until, you know, there was some accumulation of people who knew or found me that, you know, the awareness shifted in the room. But it really unnerved the curator. She wanted to put a sign right next to me that says, oh, there's a performance happening. And I kept saying, it's got to be outside of the room so that people forget about, even if they read it, which often they don't, that they would forget by the time they came in. So they had encountered me and a kind of action that's quite minimal when this exhibition came up. So I received an award from the museum, and part of it is this exhibition. They're struggling with it. They don't want a retrospective. I don't want to be showing documentation particularly. It's kind of dull to go to a museum and look at photos and long explanations that, you know, oh, you had to be there finally. So they're just as baffled about how to make it into you know, a museum event work as me. I mean, they're great and willing to take some risks. Maybe I can have an empty room when I'm not there.
I think it's very interesting that, Alastair, do you want to come straight in? I'm just bouncing straight in here. I think it's very interesting, and I suggest it's of the moment exactly, that they're looking at a retrospective of your work, but the conversation is not. I think maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it would have been the automatic to put photographs on the wall with the explanations. And that's how you would have shown a performance artist's work. And now the opportunity of the live moment, or the opening up the possibility, or even examining the possibility of the live moment, has come back not come back, because if we think of maybe just a step historically, and there's so many paths we can go back historically to, but potentially in a very simplistic way, an artist made a live performance. It was over. There was photographs. Sometimes the artist sat down and wrote a description about it. Sometimes somebody else wrote a description about it. Maybe there was some video. Maybe there's some film. And that's what we got access to, I suppose. And I think that over the last maybe 10 or 15 years, the exploration to go backwards, back to that moment of encounter between going into a museum, a dead museum with objects around it, and going in, the possibility of going in to encounter another human being has presented itself to some. I mean, it's not always available in museums and galleries, and that, I think that's a really interesting, that you're even having that conversation, that it hasn't been closed down by the museum straight away to say no, we can't deal with another. The frailty or the potentiality of the unknown when it comes to presenting presenting live performance, which is another human being presented as in the context of art, the art world, arthood, objecthood.
In the past, they had static objects, and you went in and looked at an artifact. And so, for about 100 years, we looked at a crossbow, and then in the last 15 years, we thought, what if we fire the crossbow? And so, so kind of now there's a movement in museums to show events, to show things happening. That's part of the process of reinterpreting something that you interpreted by seeing it in action. And I think maybe having performance art in museums is another method of coming up with new forms of interpretation of the heritage that is there. So, but they're struggling, I think, with all that that implies.
Well, and yeah, but they feel there's a sense of obligation that they should be including it because it is part of the world out there of art. And so trying to figure out how to do that is the question.
It's very difficult to take responsibility for what someone else does. If it's curated beforehand, we've walked around the object 5 times, came up with a conclusion, then you can put it there.
Yeah.
But it's different when you put someone in there and maybe they have, everyone has expectations, but...
And fears.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, put an artwork into an exhibition in a museum in Dundee in Scotland, where I had first been an art student, Duncan O'Jordanson College of Art, and it was some anniversary for the art school, and a number of artists were invited, and I decided to do a performance in the museum. The museum was up a floor higher than the main Dundee library, and there were many paintings in there from the 18th, 19th century. It really did feel like an old museum. Really past, everything is past there in the present. And when I was a student there, I was doing very academic figure painting, portraits, landscapes, and still lifes, and so on. So, in kind of recognition of that, I had a cotton duck canvas suit made, 3-piece suit. And I wore this for a number of days. I forget how long it was it 2 weeks or so, 3 weeks? I was in there every day doing something. What I decided to do was put a different fruit under each of the main paintings on the walls, and I decided to do some kind of installation / performance piece in relation to a different painting each day, different artwork each day. And in a small space just outside, I had a glass greenhouse, and the notion was at the end of every day, put a flower, a rose, to signify, you know, the one day's gone. And I had a title above the greenhouse saying, Can't, Can't. Now, I can't quite remember if it was C-A-N, comma, T, can't, or the other way around. It would, the work would take place during museum hours for each day, just museum hours each day. So people would come in, they'd walk around, and they would see this figure doing something in relation to a particular artwork on the wall. So I wanted to reference the context, but also to bring in some questions and queries. Someone I knew from when I was a student, who was an instructor at the art college, came up and said to me at the end, Alastair, what are you doing? You can't sell this. As though one had lost the plot over these past 30, 40 years by doing something which couldn't be commodified or quantified or really qualified in terms that would make sense to a traditionalist attitude towards what fine art was.
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably a lot of the impulse for what we sort of think of as the sort of early waves of performance art might well have been about a shift from something that could be commodified and trying to secure as an artist a sort of value system for making that was going to be within the terms that one considers the ethically appropriate terms or the aesthetically appropriate terms, as opposed to the market given terms. I suppose what's happened for us historically, though, is that the idea of distinguishing oneself from a certain kind of commodification has kind of come back again, where we're seeing these sort of re-enshrinements of kind of performance. You know, the thing that you're saying about the museum becoming interested in performance and almost wondering, wondering should one be suspicious of that? Should one be terribly positive about that? Is this art historically a sort of a good thing? But then what are the implications for any artist? And whether the whole question of re-performance, I mean, maybe to everybody it becomes sort of kind of irrelevant, because if you don't believe it can happen, or reenactment, I mean, you make a distinction, don't you, between...
Yeah. Well, I think there's loads of things you've just, to pick up on from what you were just saying there, and I think first and foremost, I think a lot of practitioners, I'd love to hear some disagreement, but we choose live performance particularly to step away from the kind of rat race of the art market and therefore your creative voice being in some ways pulled and pushed by a market rather than by what you're investigating. So we stepped away from that. It's a kind of I think a very clear choice that somebody who steps into live performance has to make. But it's all been terribly complicated over the last 10 years, I think, with Tina Segal. Because Tina Segal's work is anti-documentation, there's no anti-objecthood, but he has been collected by the biggest collections in the world, the most important collections in the world, and $80,000 has been handed over to him for an ephemeral live event. Yeah, a whisper between himself and a curator. So it absolutely complicates. I mean, he is an art star. It's a totally different rung, and a conceptual artist, very much in the maelstrom of the art market, the art world, what's fashionable at the time. It's I suppose a conceptual conceit, but it does complicate live performances' stance against the market.